Hello, welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's talk by Eva Respini. In case anyone here has not yet seen it, we have a dazzling exhibition currently on view here at the Hammer. James Welling Monograph is a comprehensive survey of 35 years of camera work by Jim Welling, an artist who operates in the hybrid ground between painting and sculpture and traditional photography. His work is held in major museum collections, including here at the Hammer, the Pompidou, the Kunstmuseum Wolfsburg, LACMA, the Met, MoCA, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, MoMA, the Guggenheim, and the Whitney. Jim is a professor here in the UCLA Department of Art and was, until recently, a member of the Hammer's Board of Overseers. He grew up in Connecticut and attended Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and CalArts. So please give yourself a present and come back and see his work in its full glory upstairs. It's a spectacular exhibition. We also offer free admission to the exhibitions every Thursday, and we're always free for any students from any school. Eva Respini is a curator based in New York, and she's currently a curator in the Department of Photography at MoMA. She's curated one-person exhibitions with artists including Cindy Sherman, Akram Zatari, Vic Muniz, Clara Lydon, and Boris Mikhailov, and group exhibitions with artists as diverse as Sarah Vanderbeek, Ai Weiwei, Michelle Abeles, Philip Lorca de Corsia, Katie Grennan, Louis Baltz, Sterling Ruby, Ronnie Horn, Nang Golden, Walid Beshti, and John Baldessari, among others. Her major survey exhibition of photographer Robert Heineken will open at MoMA in March of next year. Respini's articles and papers appear in many museum publications and periodicals. She's currently a faculty member at Columbia University in the MFA program for Visual Arts, and she's been a visiting critic at Yale School of Art and the School of Visual Arts in New York. Her interview with James Welling appears in the survey publication of his work, Monograph. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Eva Respini.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Claudia, for your wonderful introduction, and thank you to all of you for coming. I know there were dueling talks tonight in town, so I appreciate you coming here. Before I begin, a declaration. I'm not a James Welling expert. I'm a longtime admirer and fan of Welling's work, but I'm not the curator of this magnificent show, nor am I the author of the handsome book that accompanies it. James Crump, the curator of this exhibition, is far more knowledgeable than I, and I hope you all had the chance to hear him speak about the show at the Hammer earlier this fall. James Welling himself is an eloquent lecturer on his own work, and he gave a great talk here in 2011, which is online, archived on the Hammer website, and I urge you all to take a look at it. He's also giving walkthroughs of the show for undergrads and grads throughout the next couple of months, and if you can take advantage of it, I urge you to do that. I'm sure it will be a real treat. So today, I will not give a comprehensive or definitive talk about Welling's career. I won't talk about all of his bodies of work. Rather, my talk will be meandering. I will move from series to series, I will move through time, and I'll talk just about a few bodies of work. My talk will be personal in that it's related to my own areas of expertise, and it will be my own triangulation of James Welling within larger narratives of contemporary and conceptual art. Welling's work is diverse and it's hard to categorize. It doesn't fit nicely in any one genre. He doesn't have a signature style. His projects are eclectic and diverse, and he uses many methods, subjects, and processes. He moves smoothly between representation and abstraction. From experimental darkroom techniques in black and white to those made in brilliant color. From figuration to landscape. I think probably one of the most challenging aspects about Welling's work is how to grapple with this wide-ranging practice and what it all means when it comes together in a show like this at the Hammer. Perhaps the best way to understand an unorthodox artist is through unorthodox means. So today I propose a different approach to thinking about Welling's art over the last 30-some years. I propose to think about Welling's work within the context and framework of two other artists. In many circles, photographer is a bad word, especially in the contemporary art world, where cross-disciplinary practices reign. Consider three positions. James Welling, who's proud to call himself a photographer. Robert Heineken, who called himself a paraphotographer because his work stood beside or beyond traditional ideas associated with photography. And Cindy Sherman, who insists she's an artist that uses photography. So why think about Welling alongside Robert Heineken and Cindy Sherman? Why these artists? Robert Heineken is a predecessor of Welling. He was a pioneer in the 1960s and 70s in LA and founded the graduate program for photography at UCLA in 1964, where he taught until 1991. As many of you know, Welling is the head of that same department. Heineken worked across multiple mediums, including photography, sculpture, printmaking, and collage. He culled images from newspapers, magazines, and television and recontextualized them in a variety of forms, which include photograms, which is what you see here, hybrid photo sculptures, collage, and assemblage. Although Heineken was rarely behind the lens of a camera, his photo-based works question the nature of photography and radically redefine the perception of it as an art medium. I should probably mention here that Welling doesn't necessarily see Heineken as an influence, and I'm not even sure he likes his work very much. So situating Welling vis-a-vis Heineken is really my own exercise. Cindy Sherman, on the other hand, is a contemporary of Welling's. They both are associated with the Pictures generation, or what's called the Pictures generation. They both exhibited at Metro Pictures Gallery in New York in the early 1980s, alongside artists Richard Prince, Louise Lawler, and Sherry Levine, all who were, quote, using photography to investigate the status of images in a consumer and media-saturated age. Sherman's investigation into the construction of contemporary identity and the nature of representation is drawn from the unlimited supply of images provided by movies, TV, art history, and fashion. Her work reveals the artifice of identity and how photography is complicit in its making. Welling shares with Sherman a similar attitude towards photography. While their work is quite different, they have similar cultural and artistic touchstones, and both were included in the important Pictures Generation show at the Metropolitan Museum in New York a few years ago, which cemented Welling alongside his peers as a generator of ideas about image making in an image-saturated world. In the spirit of open declarations, I should probably mention that I've chosen to situate, or perhaps more accurately, triangulate, Welling with Heineken and Sherman because these are two of my own recent projects. I'm organizing a Heineken show, as Claudia mentioned, which will come to the Hammer next fall. And I recently organized the Cindy Sherman retrospective, which traveled across the US last year. But this really is not about self-promotion. What I hope to do today is find a way to understand Welling's diverse practice and perhaps to shed new light on how to think about this unique artist. In many ways, my own understanding of Welling's work is shaped by these two artists. So today I'll map out Welling's early work, how he came out of Cal Arts, and with the same generation and references as Sherman. Then I'll fast forward to more recent and materially based work by Welling, and to think about those in concert with Heineken's material experimentations of the 1960s and 70s. I think it's worth taking a few minutes to talk about Welling's early years and his formation as an artist. His childhood and adolescence was steeped in painting and drawing. He was interested in artists such as Charles Birchfield, Edward Hopper, and Andrew Wyeth. And this is a painting he made in 1967 as an adolescent. From 1969 to 71, Welling attended Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, where he made monochromatic paintings and minimalist-influenced sculptures. He enrolled in Cal Arts in 1971, where John Baldessari was teaching, and Welling was his teaching assistant for the last 2 years he was there, 1973 and 1974. As you all know, Baldessari taught a post-studio class and encouraged a cross-disciplinary approach to art making, which de-emphasized the primacy of the hand. Baldessari also encouraged his students to be well-versed in the vocabulary of images, whether they were from film, the illustrated press, or advertisements. To a certain extent, Welling has veered away from this idea in his art now, but his early works were attuned to all of these issues. And also, he was particularly interested in the sequential or relational order of pictures, and working in series continues to be an important part of Welling's work today. While Baldessari was influential on Welling, certainly, he was actually on leave for the first semester that Welling was at Cal Arts. And another important figure for him was Wolfgang Sturkel, a video and performance artist who was recruited to Cal Arts by Alan Caprow, who was encouraged to make videos by Nam June Paik. Some of Welling's first works at Cal Arts were videos, which I'll talk about in just a minute. It's important to note that Welling is self-taught in photography and photo history. He made a few photographs while he was at Carnegie Mellon, but he was never formally trained in photography. He got a view camera in 1976, inspired in part by Stephen Shore, whose works he saw in the New Topographics exhibition, which was a seminal show organized by the George Eastman House in Rochester, but traveled to the Otis Art Institute in 1975, where Welling saw it. Other early photographic influences on Welling include Paul Strand, something he's talked and written a lot about, particularly the Mexican portfolio, which Welling saw at the UCLA Library. But what allowed Welling to look at what was unquestionably a very unfashionable artist like Strand, especially during the early 1970s, was an article written by Hollis Frampton in Artforum in 1972 about Strand. And Welling admired Frampton's film and his writing, and this article was an important gateway for Welling to appreciating Strand. So, in August 1976, Welling set up his own darkroom. He taught himself how to use a camera, how to process film, the basics of analog photography. Welling said this of being self-taught, quote, "Being self-taught in photography has allowed me a certain freedom. There's a way in which I explore some aspect of the history of photography with each project, although this is unconscious and not at all systematic." He shares this self-taught background in photography with Heineken, who was also self-taught and was originally trained in printmaking and graphic arts. Heineken attended UCLA and graduated with an MFA in 1960 and studied with the printmaker Don Chipperfield. Heineken also worked as an installer and graphic designer at the White Gallery, designing the posters for all the shows there for a period of time. Due to his printmaking background, Heineken often opted to work in series and sequences, transferring, recycling, and reworking images from medium to medium. Being self-taught in photography permitted him the freedom to experiment. And now I'm quoting Heineken, who said, "I was never in a school situation where someone said, 'This is the way a photograph is supposed to look.' I was completely open to cut them up or do anything to them." The same attitude is encompassed by Sherman, who became interested in photography as it was being used by conceptual and performance artists. She didn't have much training in photography, she had a little bit, but certainly no classic photo history. In fact, when she was enrolled as an art student at the Buffalo State College in New York, she failed a mandatory photography course because she wasn't proficient at the requisite technical skills. When she took the class again, another teacher, Barbara Jo Ravel, was less concerned with technical perfection and exposed her students to conceptual art and other contemporary art movements. Sherman became aware of and interested in the work of feminist artists who performed for the camera, like Eleanor Antin or Hannah Wilke, as well as male artists such as Chris Burden and Vito Acconci, who used their own bodies as the locus in their art. But Sherman got most of her education about contemporary art from the artist-run space Hall Walls, where she had a studio for a few years with fellow artists and exhibited as well. Hall Walls also had a steady beat of visiting artists and critics and filmmakers, and everyone from Richard Serra to Robert Irwin to Lucy Lippard and to Helene Weiner visited. And Sherman has acknowledged the importance of this space on her own art education and art making. And this is something that Welling has talked about as well in terms of the time period in the 70s when there was a recession, not much of an art market, but artist-run spaces were a critical meeting point for artists to talk about their work and to make work, and I think was important to Welling as well in his education. So all three of these artists come from a largely self-taught photographic background, and I think this is really an important thing to think about as we consider all of their work and what that means. I think above all, these three artists, in their own way, work against a medium-specific understanding of photography. I think it's important to note that they shared an attitude about the medium that gets expressed in their work. They all come to photography from a non-photographic background and thus encompassed a willingness to question the status of representation in photography and the ways in which we read images today. I think another thing that these artists share is a working method that was in opposition to the street photography as epitomized by Robert Frank or Lee Friedlander or Gary Winogrand, and which at the time was being championed by the curator John Sharkovsky at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The history of that tradition, that is, formalist, straight, observational, or from a documentary mode, runs deep at MoMA and in New York. Another tradition was being developed on the West Coast, particularly in LA in the 1960s and 70s. There was a more experimental attitude towards images, which I think is deeply ingrained here. You can see it in the work from artists such as Baldessari to Wallace Berman and Heineken. But also if you think of artists like Ed Ruscha or Douglas Hubler, they had a very matter-of-fact attitude towards the medium of photography and celebrated its vernacular qualities. So these different traditions in image making on the West Coast are radically different than the East Coast. And Welling has talked about these different photographic traditions, and I quote here, "Even though I have softened my stance and am much more sympathetic to Sharkovsky and the Museum of Modern Art, I always think of myself on the other team." So in many ways, even though Welling is originally from the East Coast and spent many years in New York, he is the contemporary inheritor of some of the more experimental attitudes towards image making and his unique approach to photography. I do hope that the East Coast-West Coast rivalry is not as acute these days. As I mentioned earlier, Welling's first works at CalArts were moving images, and in the show upstairs, as you come in, one of the first walls and one of the first works you see is, in fact, some of these early moving images. And he was working primarily, or actually exclusively, in video. Video at this point was still in its infancy, and CalArts provided a lot of free video equipment for their students to use. Welling was using a studio deck and an early Portapak, and he quickly made friends with fellow students Matt Mulliken and David Sally, who were doing the same thing. Welling's early videos were usually using the entire duration of the tape. So there's a 1 hour video or a single shot, and there's an interest in many of these early videos in the relationship between the still and the cinematic, an interest in photographic phenomena, and the ways in which viewers process and understand lens-based images. His early videos focus on perception, ghostly phenomena, and how color, shadow, and focus shift with a simple gesture like covering the lens of the camera with his hand. This work, which is titled Second Tape from 1972, is just a recording of a very simple gesture of Welling's own hand moving back and forth in unfocused proximity to the camera's lens. As a result of this simple movement from foreground to background, the light and dark fields dissolve into one another, and foreground and background collapse into one. And I'll show you now just a brief clip of this. One of the things that I love about this video is Wellings seems to be doing this while the class is actually going on. You can hear a kind of lecture in the background, which maybe that's Baldessari, I'm not sure how it is. Sherman's early work and her education was very much influenced by images of all kinds, from TV to ads, but also film. While we all know her iconic Untitled film stills take their inspiration from European New Wave and art house cinema, she was also interested in more experimental film practices. In college in the 1970s, she worked for the experimental filmmaker Paul Sharits, and this exerted a certain influence on her work, especially in the earlier years. I'm going to show you briefly now a clip made of a film that she made while she was a student, titled I Hate You, made in 1975, so just 3 years after the Welling video. In fact, hers is not a video. It's a silent Super 8 film and was made as a one-take, continuous 3-minute film. So now, if you wouldn't mind rolling the clip, it's silent, so I'll talk over it. She built a box that she put over the camera, and on one side of the box was a two-way mirror. So the inside was transparent while the outside showed a reflection. The camera's lens was pointed at the transparent interior and recorded the artist's portrait while she repeated, like a mantra, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. It's unclear if she's talking to herself, to the mirror, or perhaps somebody off camera. Here's one of the rare moments when Sherman hasn't made an elaborate persona, and there's an interest in looking and perceiving, an interest that Welling also explores in his early videos. Another early work by Sherman that I want to talk about briefly is this piece from 1975, so it's the same year as the Super 8 film, and she considers this her first, quote, serious work. She used a complete roll of film to create a storyboard of a transformation of a character from kind of mousy student to vamp, complete with hand coloring to enhance the character transformation. While these are all still images, there's a tension between still and moving, and an interest in how sequence and narrative affect one another with multiple images, something she continued to think about in other works that she was creating at the time that were made up of multiple images. Now Sherman works with singular still images, but the use of multiple images encompasses a certain attitude about photography. Working with multiple images is a rejection of the unique print, the masterwork that captures the decisive moment, which is what photographic modernism has always prized. Think about singular images by artists such as Edward Weston or Henri Cartier-Bresson or Ansel Adams. Multiple images destabilize the idea of a singular fixed picture and introduce a new way of looking. And all three artists that we're talking about today have used serial images to make this very point. I want to dwell on the idea of sequence and narrative for another moment. Sequence is somewhat reoccurring in Welling's work and important to Welling, especially in his early years. His 1974 collage, And Should, which uses Winston cigarette ads from magazines, predates Richard Prince's now well-known appropriations. This triptych was in his CalArts thesis show and is the result of images cut out from magazines, something he was doing a lot of at the time with his friend and studio mate David Sally. Welling juxtaposes broken narratives and uses wordplay with the ad slogan, "There's a lot of good between Winston and Should." While appropriation is not something that stuck for Welling, I do think this piece underscores a theme running throughout much of Welling's early work, which is that images are about as much as what we bring to them as what they address. In an article that Welling and David Sally co-authored in 1980, they noted their interest in, quote, preconceptions and expectations of the possible, so that readings and experiences of works of art, especially ones that include juxtapositions like And Should, produce new, sometimes contradictory and overlapping readings. This idea of open readings and associations in photography is something that's still at play in his work today. While Sherman was associated with the pictures artists alongside Welling, she was never an appropriation artist in the vein of Richard Prince or Sherry Levine. In her work, she always took a different approach to filtering media images by folding them in as inspirations or reference points for her work. But this is an early work by Sherman that's a bit of an exception to that. She played directly with magazine images. She produced a series titled Cover Girls in 1976, where she takes covers from women's magazines like Vogue, Redbook, Cosmopolitan, and Mademoiselle. In each triptych, the first image is the original. In the second, we see Cindy Sherman's face instead of the model. And in the third, she adopts some kind of grotesque or funny expression, in effect questioning the accepted paradigms of beauty. The first cover is reproduced as is. The second is about imitation. And the third is about resistance. Sherman used an elaborate technical process in order to replace the model's face. Obviously, this is before Photoshop. She's using the photo montage techniques that are familiar through the photo montage and collage of the 1920s and 30s, practiced by people like Hannah Höch and John Hartfield. Many people have acknowledged that Heineken was appropriating images long before the pictures generation's artists came to the fore. Magazines and the printed page were the primary source material for Heineken throughout his career, expressed fully in his wide-ranging series of manipulated periodicals, which he made from the early 1960s through his career through the 1990s. He employed three basic techniques to create revised or compromised magazines, and those are his terms. The first technique was to overprint an image on every page of a publication via photolithography, like you see here. Another technique was to collate pages from various magazines and recombine them to create a new periodical. And a third was to incise magazines by cutting out elements from the page with an X-Acto knife. His magazines were intended to be handled and read, and the sequential narratives built into their pages expose the underlying structure of mass-produced illusions. By violating the integrity of advertisements and articles, they highlight intertextuality and self-referentiality. Heineken's periodicals address a range of issues, from politics and violence to consumerism and the use of sex to practically sell anything. In 1969, Heineken gathered numerous Time magazines, disassembled them, printed a pornographic image on every page, and reassembled them with the original Time covers. He circulated these reconstituted magazines into the world. He put them in the waiting room at his dentist's office here in Westwood. He slipped them back onto the newsstand to be sold unwittingly as authentic magazines. Heineken undertook a similar guerrilla action, and guerrilla is his word, in 1972 with this work, periodical number 5, where he printed a grisly image of a grinning Cambodian soldier holding 2 severed heads. And this image was originally published in Time magazine. He printed them on every page of fashion and home decor magazines, and similarly circulated them out into the world. Heineken's project was very much a critique of mass media images in the same vein as Wellings, Sherman, and their fellow pictures artists. His pioneering use of found images was an important precedent to the artists that followed. So now we'll fast forward a little bit. In 1978, Welling moved to New York and declared that he wanted to make, quote, something that had never been seen before. He started to explore the notion of abstraction as a kind of representation, something he comes back to again and again throughout his career. He spent 3 months in his loft on Grand Street working with aluminum foil, phyllo-dough, velvet drapery, making several series of photographs that are hybrid projects, pictures that are simultaneously sculptural and photographic. His aluminum foil series is his first major statement as a young artist, and I think remains among his most important body of work. Seeing them 30 years after they were made, they feel as contemporary as ever and resonate very deeply with contemporary art practice. To make these works, Welling would crumple aluminum foil, also paint on it, manipulating and transforming it for the purpose of being photographed. These aluminum foil pictures play with a very well-known, domestic, rather banal material and transforms it into something new, mysterious, and hard to read. The scale is such that you don't know if you're looking at a vast landscape or nighttime sky or a miniature. These pictures can be read on a macro and a micro level, and the scale of the prints confound this even more. The works were originally presented at a small scale at Metro Pictures Gallery in New York in the early 1980s in 2 rows of 18. And in fact, the installation upstairs is a nod to that. It's not all of the works from the series, but it is at that same small scale. The small scale forces the viewer to get close to the works. There's an importance placed on the act of physical looking. One can also think about the fact that these works can be held in the hand, even if they appear to represent a vast nighttime sky. This body of work raises the question, what is the subject? It also raises questions about desire and visual representation. Why do we look? What are we looking for? The work points out the falsity of photographic representation and transparency is something I'll come back to later. They are a critique of the modernist icons of abstraction seen in pictures by Edward Weston and Harry Callahan, but yet these photographs are also sensuous, elegant, tactile, like the work of modernist photographer Paul Strand. For me, the tension in the work is not just between the abstract and the representational, or between the flat and the three-dimensional, but there's also a tension between the conceptual and intellectual framework wherein the work acknowledges the falsity of photographic representation and an appreciation for what I would call the voluptuousness of photography. I think it's precisely in this push and pull that the work remains so interesting and still seems so fresh today. Perhaps it would be a stretch to consider Sherman's work from the mid-1980s in this context, but I thought we might as well think of them while we're here. And to think about the problem of representation, and particularly about the all-over field of constructed debris that veers towards painting and sculpture. In the mid-1980s, so this is a few years after Wellings' aluminum foil pictures, Sherman stopped using herself as a model and created outlandish and revolting scenes that explore the psychic terrain of the abject. And I don't know if you can see it, but embedded in this photograph is actually a face. These pictures feature mutilated body parts, blow-up dolls, rotting food, and substances that look like vomit, feces, and blood. Despite their gruesome qualities, the pictures are not without humor, as you can see here in the reflection of a screaming face in a pair of glasses. While some of the photographs do have shock value, that's not their primary intent. Rather, the carefully arranged tableaus are surrogates for larger narratives of violence and death. But in the end, the photographs are always produced in glossy color so that they're seductive and repulsive at the same time. And Sherman has talked about how she really was trying to create something that was both beautiful and ugly, to suck people in, but yet push them away. And I think here there's something similar at play with Wellings' experiments with the aluminum and also his phyllo-dough pictures. In his explorations of the problems of photographic representation, he still finds the need to create something beautiful. I think in his work, Welling has always succumbed to the seduction of photography, which is something James Crump wrote about in his essay, and I'm glad that he did succumb to this seduction. Despite his CalArts training, or perhaps in spite of this background, he freely celebrates texture, color, and form in his photographs, which has only gotten more pronounced when he started to work seriously with color in the 1990s. Throughout his career, Welling has made several series of photograms, that is, pictures made without the use of a camera. His first experiments with camera-less images were in 1975, and they're photograms of his hands. But starting in the mid-1990s, to today, Welling turned to photograms more seriously and significantly expanded the possibilities of this genre through many experimental bodies of work. Welling has stated that photograms are, quote, a shadow of the world, coexisting with the optical images made by the camera lens. And for him, all these kinds of images are on a spectrum. They're not either or, which I think is a really interesting position to take. Most of Welling's work with photograms began when he moved back to LA from New York in 1995 to teach at UCLA. Teaching at UCLA profoundly changed Welling's relationship to photography, and he's talked about this. As I mentioned earlier, UCLA's photography program was founded by Heineken, who worked extensively with photograms. And Welling has mentioned that perhaps Heineken's legacy with his work in photograms was a contributing factor to why he began working with photograms. After Welling moved to back to LA, he began a sequence of photograms starting with New Abstractions, what you see here, and other series include The Screens, Flowers, and Torsos, among other bodies of work that I'm not mentioning. In these body of works, Welling is increasingly investigating photography's materiality in the face of technological changes. And he deals directly with the sensitized surface of photographic paper. Welling said in 2005, and I quote, "I'm interested in finding new ways of applying materials to a surface. Photography is just a different way of applying material, and some of my works draw out this process." Among the earlier photograms that he started after teaching at UCLA were the New Abstractions, which were in the late 1990s. Here he laid strips of paper on film to make very architectural-looking pictures. And there was a kind of iterative process that went on where he then also laid strips of film on photographic paper, which were then made as enlargements, and you can see those enlargements upstairs in the show. And another thing that's great in the show is you'll see there's a vitrine in the room of these works that has a little box with these paper strips, which I think is quite wonderful because it shows how simple the process is. These stark images are handsome, they're graphic, and you can make all kinds of associations with architecture. But embedded in these pictures is a referent to photography. When he started working with the New Abstractions, Welling thought about the classic black frame in a Cartier-Bresson photograph, and he thought of this as a shadow of the camera. As Welling explains it, that black border is the opaque edge of the camera, so that it's also a kind of photogram. In essence, every picture that has a black border also incorporates a photogram. With the New Abstractions, Welling moved the classic black edge and put it in the center of the picture, making it the subject, to deal with the opacity of those bars. I'd like to point out that the pictures are actually made in the dark, so that Welling is throwing down strips of paper onto the film or photographic paper, so that there's an element of chance and performance in the making of these. And certainly there's an element of chance and performance in making all photograms. But I'd like to also think about the tactility of these works, not just in their making, but also in how they look. And then I'd like to also just briefly mention a kind of update to this series, which are the geometric abstractions which Welling made in 2008, where he used the same transparencies from the New Abstractions, but exposed them with color filters to create different combinations of color and form. And as you can see, there's quite a difference in how the photographs feel from the black and white to the color. The idea of tactility is even more present in his torso pictures made in 2008, which combines Welling's interest in photograms, his exploration in color, and this is combined with the issues that we saw in the aluminum foil pictures. The torsos explore the surface of sculpture and volume, but yet he does this without the use of a lens. To create these pictures, Welling uses ordinary window screen material, so again, like the aluminum foil, something that's widely available, kind of banal, a little bit domestic too, and he sculpted them into shapes that are reminiscent of human torsos, laid them on photographic paper, and exposed the sheet with color filtration to produce intense blues and turquoises. I would come back again to the idea of tactility, the sense of touch that I mentioned earlier with the aluminum pictures that you see here too in this body of work, not just as a viewer, but also as you think of him making them, literally sculpting these torsos. Heineken is probably best known for his photograms. And the most important among these are his series Arurea, which he executed between 1964 and 1968. This is a series of 25 photograms made directly from magazine pages. He looked through more than 2,000 magazine pages, everything from Time, Life, and Women's Day, and contact printed the magazine pages so that both sides are superimposed in a single image. So in essence, the magazine page is the negative. The resulting X-ray-like photographs merge bodies with language and hover between legibility and illegibility. This series affirms the magazine page as a window into the symbols and signs embedded in cultural iconography. The title of the series asks an open-ended question that could be interpreted either as, are you real or are you ready? There's a participatory aspect in these works. Heineken recruits the viewer to complete the reading of the work, ceding his own authority and intentionality. As Roland Barthes famously noted around the time that Heineken was creating these works, with the death of the author comes the birth of the reader. Heineken's art suggests how the possibilities offered by an open reading can also be marshaled to manufacture and manage desire. And here I want to think back at the quote that I read by Wellings and Sally when they were thinking about the different ways in which sequencing and narrative can influence and perhaps confuse meaning. Heineken made other kinds of photograms as well, including a series of photograms he made in the 1980s of food, which may be interesting to compare formally to Wellings' flower pictures, although I won't do that. But in the late 1980s, he revisited the technique that he used for Aryurea in a series titled Recto Verso. Like Aryurea, he used a single magazine page, this time from fashion magazines, as a negative to make the photographs. The Cibachrome process results in a positive image. These are Cibachrome pictures. So the combined rectos and versos explode with brilliant color, enhanced by the paper's shiny surface. While these are much more legible than our Aryurea pictures, these color photographs produce their own different brand of obscene and grotesque juxtapositions. Wellings' investment in color is important, and I think it's interesting to think about how he revisited the new abstractions with color and how color changes those pictures so radically. The graphic nature of the new abstractions gives way to a much more sensuous quality in the geometric abstractions. And a similar process occurs with Heineken's redux of Aryurea with Recto Verso, and that color can completely change the work. While Heineken and Wellings' uses of photograms are quite different, it seems the practice of photograms has a tremendous legacy within the walls of UCLA. And I think these artists in their own ways have radically expanded the possibilities of camera-less images, ultimately altering our understanding and definition of the medium of photography and its expanded possibilities. The last body of work I want to discuss are Wellings' glass house pictures, which were made between 2006 and 2009. This series is among his very best, in my opinion, and in many ways incorporate and combine the many investigations from throughout his career. With this body of work, Welling inscribes his interest in color, phenomenology, architecture, and landscape. For me, the idea of transparency is a key issue in this body of work, and an idea that Welling explores on multiple levels. Philip Johnson's famously clear glass house here is just a lens through which we can see the surrounding Connecticut landscape, a landscape that Welling knows well, since he's originally from Connecticut and actually has gone back on multiple projects to photograph there. Welling had an indirect route to the glass house, and I think this is interesting to note, so I'll diverge a little bit. In the early 1980s, he worked in the Department of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art, and this department was founded by Philip Johnson in 1930. Welling worked as an art handler and also as a photographer. When the museum was preparing for an expansion in 1984, Welling helped wrap the entire collection for the move. Welling also shot design objects, furniture, and drawings that were housed in the museum's Mies van der Rohe archive. So he got to know the Mies archive extremely well, and this is one of the treasures of the Mies archive from MoMA's collection, a drawing of his Farnsworth house. And as many people know and have noted, Johnson's glass house is heavily influenced by Mies's Farnsworth house. In fact, directly before making his glass house pictures, Welling was making multiple exposure photographs of the Farnsworth house using 6 color filters: red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, and yellow. He showed these pictures to a photo editor at New York Magazine, and she asked him to do a similar thing with Johnson's glass house. So that's how the series came to be. I think the backstory of Johnson via Mies at MoMA is a crucial one, but also the idea of getting to that architecture through the objects in MoMA's collection, thinking about them from the point of view of drawings or design objects or models, is a kind of crucial idea in understanding the glasshouse pictures for me. From the very moment that Wellings started photographing the glass house, he came to that project with a host of associations and his own history with those materials. The way that Welling creates the glass house pictures is actually very simple. He's photographing outdoors on Philip Johnson's estate, which houses actually many buildings, not just the glass house. And he's holding out color filters in front of the camera lens. While the brilliant color might suggest otherwise, these works are not created digitally in post-production. Even though Welling initially planned on adding color in post-production, in the end, he thought that the pictures were more successful with the colorization made in camera. I think there are a handful of exceptions to this, where Welling did a few post-production tweaks, but the majority of them are not. He enhanced the effect of the filters through sun flares and reflected lights to create even more saturation and confusion. In these pictures, the glass house becomes a sculptural object that Welling manipulates through light and color. Think back again to his experience of packing and photographing the objects in the MoMA collection. Here, Welling combines different layers of transparency through his colored films and plays with the visibility of an architectural icon that is all about the idea of achieving a transcendent quality in the reductive use of materials. Many of Welling's works have the idea of a screen or a filter in front of the lens or the picture or the viewing plane, and this is an example of that. Think back to the video I showed with the hand moving in and out in front of the lens. And I think that gesture, in a way, is really symbolic when thinking about the glasshouse pictures as well. For me, Welling is deeply invested in the idea of transparency and opacity and what those terms mean in photography and through lens-based representation. Remember that photography, mostly straight photography, is often thought of as a transparent window onto the world. I think all of Welling's work asks us to reconsider that notion, and this body of work in particular synthesizes so many ideas about what transparency means in photography. The idea of transparency, projection, the play between what you can see and what you can't see is something that I also want to look at with Heineken. Heineken worked a lot with transparent materials, using them on their own, hanging them simply as transparencies, or laying them over on top of magazine collages, or in one case, on top of a TV set. This is his first large-scale sculptural installation called TV Time Environment from 1970, which was installed in several different iterations, which investigates the idea of transparency and overlay in a different way. Essentially, it's a recreation of a domestic living room with a chair, a side lamp, a plant sometimes, and a functioning TV set. And layered on top of the functioning TV set is a transparency of a female nude. The images that are visible through the torso of the woman, through the nude torso of the woman of the functioning TV, were a variety of images. It was live TV at the time in 1970, so you might imagine there's Vietnam news updates, ads for local car dealerships or sitcoms, producing surreal moments of social satire and commentary. So I'm going to show you now a very short clip of this work as it was installed as part of the Pacific Standard Time show about Heineken and Wallace Berman. I'm sorry for the low quality of this. This is the only thing I could find. But you get the idea here of sort of looking through the body and looking through the torso to the images beyond. Heineken produced several iterations of TV Time Environment, and he translated the live sculptural environment into two-dimensional still works as well. In one of the installations, Heineken photographed the television set with a 35mm camera and made a set of 3M prints, a process that allowed him to manipulate and intensify the color. TV Time Environment underscores Heineken's complicated relationship to photography. On one hand, his sculptural installation, which becomes the mechanism for producing a new set of two-dimensional works, illustrates how he skirted conventional notions of media and continually sought to transform one media into another. Yet, from the live TV images, he created still, decisive images, revealing a continual engagement with the temporality of photography. With both Welling and Heineken's projects, the idea of transparency in photography becomes a pivotal question, and for me, it's an open challenge to the notion of photography as a window onto the world. But also with these works, photography is not an ends to itself, but rather part of a process of performative actions or operations to execute a body of work. And for me, in many ways, the Glasshouse pictures carry that same resonance of performativity. I'd like to conclude by returning back to my first slide. I hope I've gone beyond some surface comparisons and formal similarities. What I hope I've done is to think about artistic strategies that link these three artists. For me, Welling is a hybrid artist, and I suppose that's why I've attempted to situate him between these two other artists. On one hand, Welling is part of the Pictures group of artists, and he shares with them an exploration and a critique of representation, or thinking critically about how things are already pictured in the world. Welling and Sherman share the same touchstones and backgrounds that have formed their thinking of what it means to make images today, even though they now come to photography from very different perspectives. On the other hand, Welling shares with Heineken an interest in material experimentation. And he's aligned with Heineken's hands-on approach to image making. If you look at Welling's drapery pictures, or the aluminum foil pictures, or the gelatin pictures, there's a real tactility to them. To a certain extent, one could see this in light of Heineken's thinking about the medium, and I quote here by Heineken, "The photograph is not a picture of something, but an object about something." And this, in fact, was the title of an essay that he wrote. Another similarity is that both Welling and Heineken insist on a photographic context, despite the fact that their work has questioned the very conventions of photography. As a founder of UCLA's photography program, Heineken was deeply engaged in photographic education, even though he rarely used the camera in the traditional sense. And Welling proudly calls himself a photographer, and also is deeply engaged in thinking about photographic history, materials, and pedagogy, despite the distance that many of his pictures generation peers have put between themselves and photography. So regardless of what they call themselves, I think Welling, Sherman, and Heineken all share the belief that photography does not just bolster a theoretical position, but rather can be a medium with a capacity for uncertainty. Welling, Sherman, and Heineken don't gel with the cool analytical approach to image making preferred by conceptual and minimal artists. They all celebrate photography's capacity for beauty in all forms, while also questioning the medium's relationship to the indexical. I think these three artists are asking the same questions, but answering them in radically different ways. Welling's work is difficult to categorize, intellectually challenging, but in the end, always wondrous and beautiful. I think what Welling does in his work is explore the aesthetic potential and language of the medium in ways that are not didactic, but rather provocative and aesthetic. Welling is absolutely an aesthetic photographer, deeply concerned about and attuned to both the formal and conceptual qualities of image making. But perhaps most importantly, he's interested in the perceptual qualities of how we look at images today. He uses many strategies and art-making principles to do this, synthesizing them for his own purposes to make his own unique body of work. I think if I had to name a subject for the entire oeuvre, it would be photography. His work is a kind of tour de force of photography history in many ways. It's as if he's working through all the materials and processes in photography's history one by one. I can't emphasize the centrality of materiality and process enough in Welling's work, and you can see it very much at play in the exhibition and the book. For example, in the exhibition, there are many vitrines that expose or explain the process of making the work. In the book, there's a great glossary at the back where Welling also explains blow by blow how he made the work. Not only does it underscore how important process is to the understanding of Wellings' work, but in many ways it's like a conceptual art instruction piece where he explains a set of operations that he enacts to make the work. So the making is important to understanding. And I think what comes from that is the idea that Wellings' work is a model for looking. Each body of work uses a different set of materials and processes and thus creates and demands different modes of looking, seeing, and experiencing. With Wellings' work, looking is always a pleasure, and one can get lost in the process of seeing. Over his 40-year career, Welling has engaged in a consistent dialogue about photography, existing image conventions, and on ideas of how we look. I have learned a lot about photography from looking at Wellings' work, and I thank him for that privilege and that pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I'm just curious if you could, maybe we could expand a little bit a discussion around beauty. That's one thing that I think he doesn't share with the other artists, although they're very interested in beauty and maybe rejecting beauty. But I find his work unique in that way, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. You sort of alluded to it at the end.
I agree. I think beauty is a bad word, a dirty word in the way that photography is, in certain circles at least. And I suppose that's what I meant when I say that he's an aesthetic photographer, really attuned to form, color, textures, in a way formal qualities, but I think it goes beyond that. Something I didn't talk very much about with Welling is his interest in color, and I think while one could think about that through conceptual means, there's also something that's very experiential about an exploration of color that's very physical and to me comes down a lot to beauty. And what I admire with Welling is that he's kind of unabashed in admitting that, or in reveling. His pictures revel in beauty, I think, very much in how they're produced and how perfect they are. So I think you're absolutely right that beauty does play a big role, and probably less so with Heineken and Sherman, although I would say with Sherman, beauty is important, and to a certain extent she rejects conventions of beauty, and that's more physical beauty. But her works, and I alluded to this with the kind of, decay, vomit works, are very beautiful. They're very painterly, they're very colorful, they're very luscious, they're very glossy, and she was really wanted to sort of bring out the beauty or how those works, even though being ugly, could be beautiful. So to a certain extent, I think she has thought about beauty as well, probably not to the extent that Welling has.
I think of Cindy Sherman and Heineken as being very subversive in ways, and I was wondering if you felt the same way about Welling in the way he's pushing the envelope, but in different ways.
I think absolutely he's subversive. I mean, they're all doing it in very different ways. But I think in walking through the show upstairs, it's sort of what I said in the beginning, it's a very eclectic and diverse art practice, and I think hard sometimes to wrap your brain around. How is it that this is the same artist making pictures about the railroad and degradés? And I think that's where the subversion comes in for me in many ways, that he's pushing the envelope of not just photographic representation and seeing, but really also what we expect from an artist. And, especially these days with very kind of market-driven art world, artists kind of have this sort of tunnel vision. And I really admire Jim for his capacity to constantly push the envelope with his own work, constantly think of new projects that might seem very unfashionable, like going back to Andrew Wyeth is something that, many people might not dare to do, but yet he has reveled in that. So I think maybe that's where I see him as subversive. If there's no more, then I thank you all for coming tonight.